Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Ifunanya Ejikeme this afternoon. Before joining KCU, she graduated from the University of Cincinnati with her BS in Biological Sciences, minoring in both chemistry and psychology. During 2017-18, she served as VP on the executive board of the UC African Students Association, where she coordinated biweekly seminars. In 2018-19, she was a research assistant too at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where she conducted lab experiments investigating FGF and Notch signaling during vertebral segmentation. From this, she was able to author on the 2019 paper titled Mechanics of the Microtubule Seam Interface Proved by Molecular Simulation and Vitro Severing Experiments, published in the Journal of Physical Chemistry. This summer, she was awarded the Summer Student Research Fellowship from KCU and has been working remotely with Dr. Rogers on a meta-analysis investigating the effects of moderate physical activity on inflammatory markers in type 2 diabetic patients. She also took initiative to take part in the COVID-19 Journal Club covering the topic of today. If I could please remind everyone to mute their mics and raise their hands for questions. I will help moderate with the hand raising along with Dr. Staudinger, and I'll let you take it away. Thanks, Naya.
Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to the Journal Club. So the article for today's presentation is titled Vitamin D Concentrations and COVID-19 Infection in UK Biobank. So before delving into the article, I'm just going to give a brief overview on vitamin D and how it's converted to the active form and its functions in the body. So about 90% of vitamin D is absorbed from the sun through the skin, and about 10 to 20% is gotten through dietary sources. So once we get the vitamin D in circulation, it goes to the liver and it's converted to 25 hydroxy vitamin D, and then in the kidney it's converted to 1 alpha 25 dihydroxy vitamin D, which is the active form of vitamin D. So the active form of vitamin D has tons of different roles. We know it primarily for the bone metabolism roles, like in the intestine, it helps in the absorption of calcium and phosphate, and then it helps in bone mineralization by the absorption of phosphate. I'm going to go into more detail on its effect in the immune cells in the next few slides, and it also helps inhibit tumor growth. So before going into detail about vitamin D and its effect in the immune cells, I'm just going to cover how the virus causes severe infection in some and mild infection in others. So what we see is the virus gets into the lungs and it gets to the level of the alveolar cells, which is the zoomed in picture right here. There's two types of alveolar cells. We have the type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. I hear an echo. I don't know if somebody is...
That was an open mic. It's okay. I closed it.
Okay. So yeah, we have type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. The type 2 alveolar cells have the ACE2 receptors where the virus binds into and gets into the cell. So this is an electron microscope picture of the virus. Once it invades the cell, it uses the cell machinery to replicate itself. And what we see right here is a picture of the virus in yellow bursting out of the cell. So at this point, it's invaded the cell and replicated, and it bursts out of the cell. And at this point, the cell is damaged, so it also releases cytokines. So in normal immune response, what we see is an increase in inflammation, and over time that resolves. But in severe infection, we're not sure why this is, but we see just a continuous increase in cytokines and recruitment of tons of immune cells into the lungs, which leads to edema in the lungs, as a result causing acute respiratory distress syndrome, which we know is one of the main causes of death in COVID-19. The cytokine storm can also cause systemic effects, resulting in multi-organ failure. So now let's talk about how vitamin D can reduce acute respiratory distress syndrome. So what we see is that innate immune cells like the macrophages, dendritic cells, they have vitamin D receptors. and they're capable of converting 25-hydroxy vitamin D to 1-alpha-25-dihydroxy vitamin D. So once it gets into the cell of like the innate immune cell, it can modify gene expression. And I highlighted too, so it can increase cathelicidin, which has both antiviral and antibacterial properties. And it can also increase the cytokine IL-10, which we know has anti-inflammatory properties. So overall, having a vitamin D can make the immune system more tolerant. Another less talked about effect of vitamin D is how it inhibits renin and then overall inhibiting the RAS system. So I don't know if you remember the picture I showed of the virus leaving the cell. So it can also infect the neighboring cells like the pulmonary capillaries, which the endothelium also has ACE2 receptors. And what we see is that once the virus gets into the cell, it downregulates the ACE2 receptors. And then we know that ACE is responsible for hydrolyzing angiotensin 2. So if there's decrease in ACE2 receptors, we're going to have an increase in angiotensin 2. So what we end up having is vasoconstriction in these pulmonary capillaries, which are right next to the type 2 alveolar cells. So having vitamin D can inhibit renin and overall inhibit the RAS system from being overactive. So now let's transition to the article we came here for today. So the background of the article talks about how, we already know COVID-19 was discovered in 2019 and it has a fatality rate of around 1 to 2%. And we also know that it disproportionately affects Black and minority ethnic groups. And what we also know is that darker skin absorbs less UV rays. So on average, it has less or lower concentrations of vitamin D in the blood. The hypothesis of this study states that vitamin D concentration is associated with increased COVID-19 risk, and it tries to explain it in part or wholly by higher incidence of COVID-19 in minority ethnic groups. So for their methods, they had access to the UK Biobank, which had over 500,000 participants, and this data was collected from 2006 to 2010. The age group range was from 37 to 73 years, and it happened across England, Scotland, and Wales. And the COVID-19 test results were provided by the Public Health of England, and a total number of 2,724 COVID-19 tests were conducted on 1,474 individuals. Out of these 1,474 individuals, 449 tested positive for COVID-19. And COVID-19 infection was defined by one positive test. So for vitamin D measurements, they already had access to the UK Biobank with over 500,000 participants. So they had access to their urine samples and blood samples too. So they were able to get data, complete data for vitamin D concentration on 348,598 participants. The minimum detectable value for vitamin D was 10 nanomole per liter, and then the maximum detectable value was 375 nanomole per liter. Other variables were also studied as confounding variables in this article. So they had ethnicity, smoking status, diabetes, household income, which were self-reported, and they also measured blood pressure at a baseline visit. BMI was also calculated using the weight over the height in kilogram over meter square. So the more variables that they also studied were socioeconomic deprivation, which they calculated using information like car ownership, house ownership, and the higher the score, the more socioeconomically deprived you are. Health was self-reported as excellent, good, fair, or poor, and chronic illness was self-reported as yes or no. So now let's move on to the analysis and the actual results of the study. So they conducted a logistic regression analysis, which I just tried to give a brief explanation right here. that it models the probability of an event occurring depending on the values of independent variables. So the probability of the event occurring in this case would be COVID-19. So the first univariable logistic regression analysis was performed to ascertain the association between vitamin D concentration and confirmed COVID-19 infection. So in the first set of results, we see the different confounding variables we talked about and the number of patients with the percentage that did not have COVID-19 and those that had COVID-19 and the p-value. So for sex, we see a significant p-value with males being more likely to get COVID-19 than their female counterparts. And for self-reported ethnicity, we also see a significant p-value with the minority groups being more likely to get COVID-19 than the white population. And Blacks had the highest risk of getting COVID-19. What I found interesting was that the p-value for current smoking status was not significant, and they actually had two contradicting studies. The first one was that smoking leads to progression of a secondary infection like pneumonia in COVID-19. But they also, a more recent study showed that the rate of COVID-19 is actually lower in smokers. And the hypothesis is that nicotine also binds to ACE2 receptors. The next confounding variable that was studied was Townsend deprivation, which showed that a significant p-value with those with higher deprivation being more likely to get COVID-19. We also see BMI having a high p-value with those being overweight and obese being more likely to get COVID-19 than the normal weight participants. So here they try to ascertain vitamin D concentrations for those without COVID-19 and those with COVID-19. And we see a significant p-value with those without COVID-19 having a median value higher than those with COVID-19. So next, they had a forest plot with the different confounding variables here and the odds ratio of getting COVID-19 listed right here. So for self-reported ethnicity, the dotted line right here is the reference population. So right here for the self-reported ethnicity, we see the white population as the reference population. And we see that Black people are like 4.5 times more likely to get COVID-19 than the white reference population. And South Asians are around 2.5 times more likely to get COVID-19. And also the other minority groups that were studied were also more likely to get COVID-19 than the white counterparts. We also see in gender that males are more likely to get COVID-19 than the female counterparts as the reference group. And then for BMI, we also see that compared to the normal weight, every other group was more likely to get COVID-19 or had a higher risk of getting COVID-19 than the normal weight as the reference group. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so they did more statistical analysis and they conducted another univariable logistic regression to find the association between ethnicity and confirmed COVID-19 infection. The model was first adjusted for vitamin D concentration, and then afterwards it was adjusted for other confounding variables that we talked about, like BMI, Townsend deprivation value, the chronic illness. And then finally, they had a multivariable analysis, which used ethnicity and vitamin D deficiency as the interaction terms. So here, this table shows the association between COVID-19 and vitamin D. So we see in the vitamin D deficient group, there was a significant p-value with those who are deficient being more likely to get COVID-19. But once they did the multivariable analysis and adjusted with all the variables listed below, we see that the p-value is no longer significant. They also studied the association between ethnicity and confirmed COVID-19 infection. So the white population was used as the reference group. And what we see is that the p-value is significant, even in the univariable analysis, with minority groups being more likely to get COVID-19 than the reference white population. And then even after it was adjusted for vitamin D concentration, we still saw that the minority groups were more likely to get COVID-19 than the white counterparts. And even in the multivariable analysis, once it was adjusted for all the variables listed below, we still see that the minority groups had a significant p-value of showing that they were more likely to get COVID-19 even after all the adjustments they made. So now we're going to move on to the discussion on what they found. So they found that there was no association between vitamin D and COVID-19 infection, even after they adjusted for all the confounding variables. They also found that vitamin D concentration, even though it was lower in those with darker skin, was not linked to the risk of getting COVID-19 infection. Overall, they found a 4-fold risk in Black participants of getting COVID-19 compared to the white population, and a 2-fold risk of getting COVID-19 in South Asians compared to the white population. So I just tried to, my thoughts on why minority groups are more likely impacted. So I looked up the social factors in CDC, and these were what they came up with. So they said that ethnic minorities are more likely to live in densely populated areas, so they're more likely to transmit the virus in general. And also their neighborhoods are further from medical facilities, so they have less access to healthcare, and they're also more likely to be uninsured and more likely to be essential workers and have jobs without sick leave. And also, as we know now, there's also possibly a role of genetics in this. We know that the ACE2 gene is highly polymorphic. And this article is still in preprint, but they found these two single nucleotide polymorphisms, that one was more common in African people, that it was seen to have a more protective function in African people. And this was found in European population. So this article is still in preprint, so it has to be peer reviewed, and then maybe we can get more information about what's going on. I also found another article in Nature. This one has actually been published, and it found that this specific SNP had a higher allele frequency in Chinese populations compared to other ethnic groups. Overall, they did not find an association between diabetes or blood pressure and COVID-19 risk. And this sounds like it goes against what we already know, but they did not study the severity of the COVID-19 cases. They just studied if diabetes or blood pressure would make you more susceptible to getting COVID-19, which was not the case. But we know that having diabetes or blood pressure can exacerbate COVID-19 complications. They also did not find an association between smoking and COVID-19. So from this study, we can make the conclusion that vitamin D levels cannot be used to assess COVID-19 risk, and that the vitamin D supplements are unlikely to provide a potential and effective intervention for minority groups. So I'm just going to move on to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the study. Overall, they had the UK Biobank with over 500 participants, so 500,000 participants. So they had access to a large sample size. They had extensive phenotyping and a central processing lab. But the biggest weakness is that they did not measure vitamin D concentrations during infection or when the patient was admitted, because from earlier in this presentation, I talked about how the UK Biobank collected their samples from 2006 to 2010. So all the samples were already stored at that time. and that was what was used for analysis. So this was not a recent measurement. Also, the population was predominantly Caucasian, and they lived in less socioeconomically deprived areas. And also, they reported fewer health conditions. So I just wanted to end by talking about other studies that are currently going on related to vitamin D and COVID-19 infection. So these two, they're both clinical trials, and they're both in preprint, so they haven't been peer-reviewed, but they're on PubMed right now. So the first one is an Israeli study, and they showed that the mean plasma vitamin D level was significantly lower in COVID-19 patients. And they also did a multivariable analysis using socioeconomic status, age, gender, physical disorders, and they found vitamin D to be an independent risk factor. But what they did not do was add ethnicity to their multivariable analysis. So that's the weakness of the study. But the results showed that vitamin D was an independent risk factor for COVID-19. The other study was a local study, and it showed the higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in patients that required ICU admission. I mean, this goes along to what we talked about in the beginning of how vitamin D can help make the immune system more tolerant. So I'm not surprised by this result. And then with that, I'm going to move on to the discussion aspect of it.
Thank you, Naya. There is a question. Mike Johnston, go ahead, please, Dr. Johnston.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, I thought your presentation was very good, and I want to show my respect. Can you pronounce for me your last name?
Yeah, it's Ejikeme.
Can you say it again, please?
It's Ejikeme, so Ejikeme.
Ejikeme?
Shelly can help, yes.
I can help. So I actually did a cheat sheet. So I pronounce it, what I did was everywhere that you see the E, it's eh. So E-H-G is how I cheated. So E-H-G and then K-E-H-M-E-H. Ejikeme.
Yeah. Great job, Shelly.
Dr. Ejikeme, thank you very much for your presentation. I've got a couple questions for you.
Okay.
First and foremost, it's hard to believe that there was no correlation between smoking and COVID infection.
Right.
I'm sure I got that clear in your presentation. Can you rationalize why there wasn't?
Yeah, so I talked about, they had two contradicting articles that they talked about. So one showed that smokers were more likely to have a progression with their COVID-19 pneumonia. But then there's a recent study that showed that smokers are actually at less risk of having COVID-19. And the hypothesis is nicotine also binds to ACE2 receptors. So I feel like we have to let more time pass before we can make it definitive, for more studies to come out to actually have a definitive answer to that.
Yeah, I would agree to that, because that's a hard one to swallow, because
I know.
that's just, anyhow, it is a paradox, and it's unusual. The other thing, after you have reviewed this article, was there anything in that article that stood out as a surprise to you?
I think the smoking was definitely a surprise to me too. The same way it was a surprise to you. Yeah.
Yes.
And also how diabetes and blood pressure did not, they were not associated with increased risk of getting COVID-19. That I also thought was surprising.
Yeah. You know, I think there's something that says about, from an ethnicity perspective, and the social economic status. And when I say that, you know, you are looking at some uninsured essential workers.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of a foregone conclusion that that group of folks have a higher risk.
Yeah.
And to imply, and I know you didn't, but the corollary between vitamin D and COVID, it didn't stand up, did it?
No.
No. Okay, thank you very much. I thought you did a nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I think you and I both, that was sort of the shocker on the results, that it didn't seem to play a role like a lot of us suspected. So we have some other questions. Student Dr. Jessica Jackson, go ahead, please.
All right, hi. So one of the questions that I was having, related to the article and stuff, and I was just, curious as to what you think about it is, I've seen, like several different studies in the preprints talking about, the vitamin D and the correlation between the low levels and people having, worse COVID-19 infection.
Yeah.
But another thing that, one thing that I've seen a lot from like nursing home populations is that people who live in nursing homes and who are very ill and infirm tend to have, more vitamin D deficiency, or there's a higher prevalence of it. And so, I was just curious about what you think about how, studies can be controlled to ensure that, this is an actual correlation and not, an actual causation and not just a correlation.
Right. I mean, from peer-reviewed publications now, we do know that vitamin D does play a role in reducing cytokine storm and making the immune system more tolerant. That we do know for sure. And then we also know that nursing, the older you get, you're more likely to stay indoors. And nursing home patients probably don't get out a lot. And we get most of our vitamin D from the sun. So just in general, I'm not surprised that they do have lower vitamin D levels compared to the general population. Yeah, I think what question would you like answered specifically? Those are my thoughts on it. But if you have any more specific question, I can answer.
Dr. Schneider, is it okay if I jump in here? Because I want to dovetail on that comment. If it were causative, what would you guys in the room, and you specifically, Naya, or anybody else in the room, expect from then putting back vitamin D in COVID patients? Would that make the course of their disease, would you expect that to make the course of their disease less severe if it were causative?
I can go first before every other person chimes in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would definitely think it would, like I showed in this slide right here, we do see that vitamin D is capable of modifying gene expression and increasing IL-10, which is anti-inflammatory. So I do believe putting vitamin D or supplementing patients with vitamin D can lead to less severe outcomes. That's what.
Is there any literature showing that or investigating that?
Yeah, peer reviewed. I think, did I attach it? It should be at the bottom of the page. But yeah, there's literature showing that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And thank you for engaging in this endeavor. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. Severing.
Yes, it's been great discussion. It looked like SD Jackson put her hand back up. Did you want to follow up on that, Jess, since there was another comment right after?
Oh, I thought that Dr. Steininger was just asking if we had an opinion as to whether supplementing vitamin D would help if it turns out that vitamin D deficiency, turns out to be, a causative risk factor. But
yes, he was, and I think that's where Naya followed up with a reference that she had. Did you have any other sources that maybe you could provide too?
You know what, never mind. I don't have any actual sources. I just had like a thought.
All right. No, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Dr. Schneider, go ahead, please. You're muted.
You're mute, yeah.
Yeah, but not my.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for good presentation. I just would like to add some clarification, which questions occurred during discussion. So first of all, we need to clearly separate two entities. That's what when vitamin D doesn't affect the fact of being infected. It's not the risk, which is factor which protect you, but it is actually play critical role the outcome of this infection, whether it will be mild or whether it will be severe form. And here, undoubtedly, it is a very important because vitamin D, it is a very strong immunoregulatory molecule. It is inhibit inflammatory responses of T cell macrophages. When we have acute distress syndrome, it's actually some also considered chronic macrophage syndrome when they are overactivated, produce a barrage of inflammatory cytokines, and that's perpetuate that chronic inflammation, which actually leads to the death. Here, it's absolutely strongly active. Now, as a factor which will reduce the mortality. I don't know whether they use these particular studies right now using vitamin D as a supplement in these severe ill patients, because I think it will be inhumane to take this study and separately use only vitamin D. So that is probably limitation for them. Now, talking about role of nicotine. It's actually, for me, it's not a surprise. This is what we're talking, particularly to the question of Mike. Right, so if we take ulcerative colitis, the rate of ulcerative colitis actually in smokers much lower than in non-smokers. And that is also, again, nicotine is potent anti-inflammatory substance, which regulates. So here, of course, on the time when it is infection occurs, right? So infection with comet, I don't think that severe ill patients have a chance to smoke, right? So, but generally that is what expected, why it might be working there. So, but you have to consider it as a double-edged sword. Nicotine can produce morphological changes in the lungs if it's chronically used. So, and here probably sometimes results are a little bit mixed. If the person still smokes, but I mean, relatively young smoker, that's probably will be beneficial effect of the smoking. Now, but what I'm saying here is again, acute respiratory distress syndrome, absolutely. Driven by cytokines produced primarily by innate immune cells. But not only that, it is a kind of umbrella, all of them. Particularly very important is IL-6. And it's coming to the point because it actually produces apoptosis in B cells. So now there is this hypothesis why people who had relatively severe form and recover, they don't last their antibodies in the body after recovery. It is very short period, which absolutely unusual. One is possibility is that during that response, significant of amount IL-6 is actually killing those cells, plasma cells, and not making long-lived plasma cells. That is one of the explanations. No surprise that in Italy, some physicians were using exactly antibodies, anti-IL-6 antibodies, and the results are phenomenal on the recovery of those severely ill patients. That is why comments for that, and that's only to support your great presentation, Ifunanya. Did I correctly pronounce?
Thank you. Yeah, you did a great job.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'll echo those same things. It was a great presentation. There was some surprises in the results. I think you backed it up with other literature that you looked at. Let me see. We have another question. Dr. Sarsour, go ahead.
Hi. I just want to compliment you on your presentation. Great. The way you identified the weakness and the strength of the study is really really good. Now, my question is just, it's not really a question, it's like, if you get the chance to do such a study on, vitamin D or something that will integrate to see how minority are affected, how you'll do it?
Yeah.
In your opinion.
Okay, so my ideal study would have a multivariable analysis where you take into account all like the variables like BMI, gender, ethnicity is a big one too. I would also measure the vitamin D concentrations at like the time of infection as opposed to using previous samples. And then what would I do? I would also use a large sample size just to make sure and have like central processing kind of like they did. But the main difference, I thought their study was really good. The main issue would be like the length of time between the sample collection and when it was actually used for the research. So that would be the only change I would make.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Dr. Schneider, do you have a follow-up?
I just would like to, just historical relatively to our university. If you've been on the main campus and admin block, on the fourth floor there is a kind of veranda. I was told that in 30s, where we didn't have antibiotics, that was a place where TB patients were placed during the summer. And what I would like to say, that was empirical finding that sun and dry air helps to cure TB. Because only in early 2000, I believe 5 or 2004, where the property of vitamin D as immunoregulatory molecule was described. So now look, description of the effect came in 2000, but empirically physicians used the exposure to UV for treat tuberculosis, because in tuberculosis, vitamin D, extremely important. Extremely important. Just a piece of information. If you visit administrative corpus, go on the fourth floor and you can go on that veranda. And about maybe 80 years ago, there was filled with the patients who was nothing to do, just try to save from TB by exposure to sun. That's just discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for that history there, Dr. Schneider. That's very cool. Dr. Johnston, you have a follow-up?
I do, and I'm glad Dr. Snyder brought that up. I am biased when I think of United Kingdom and I see clouds, overcast, and darker days. And I don't know how many days in UK are blessed with sunlight. And I think Dr. Snyder's comment about the value of the sun is part of this this picture. I think what Dr. brought forth is a sizable, when the study was, these samples were obtained, sizable number of sample volume in a window that precedes this by, unless I misunderstood you, precedes this by 9 years, up to 9 years. So it's from 2006 to 2010. I thought that's where the numbers had the numbers had been collected for vitamin D levels. So correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes, you're completely right. So they were just collecting, I think they did the UK Biobank just to assess what the population was going to die. It was basically for other reasons, but now we have a pandemic, so they also use it. Yeah.
Yes, I understand that. Again, I just can't help but think about the level, about the stereotypic picture in my mind of the amount of sunlight that UK gets. I just don't know that answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. Dr. Schneider, you had another comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, if I just would like to, I was working with British physicians and they were joking. And that joke, one of them, do you remember last summer? Or the same, it is July 25th when the sun comes up. All right, so.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. Dr. Sarsour, did you have a follow-up question? Go ahead, please.
I had just a small question. Did you check if there is any literature talking about vitamin D and other respiratory viral infection, like common cold or, you know, or flu or other maybe SARS? Have you checked that?
Yeah, I saw one of that when I was looking at this analysis, but I didn't really pay too much attention just because I was focused on, but there's definitely been studies on that. I can look it up again and send you an email, but I wasn't paying too much attention to it.
Okay.
But I did see something similar.
Yeah, I just want to see how they did the rationale for this study to see, you know, vitamin D have something with the respiratory infection. So
the general consensus was from something I saw. I don't really remember which specific virus it was, but it does reduce acute respiratory infections. But I feel like I have to go back to it just in general. Vitamin D supplementation does do that, but I don't remember all the details.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Go ahead, Dr. Staudinger.
Vitamin D, as most people know, and I'm acutely aware, is a high affinity ligand for the vitamin D receptor, the topic of your research. And thus, because I study nuclear receptors, it is incredibly important. It must be the most important transcription factor family on the planet, especially when it comes to immune responses. So thank you so much, Naya, for highlighting this notion for me. It helped.
No problem.
It helped bring home my love for nuclear receptors and validated it. Thank you.
Yes, Naya, thank you again for your presentation. It was great. It generated great discussion, and we truly appreciate you as a first year taking the initiative to do that this summer. It says a lot about you as a student and as our future clinician in this. I couldn't say enough about you. Thank you again, Naya. It was amazing. Everybody, we do have. Go ahead, Naya. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say thank you all for the compliments. I'll keep trying to keep up the good work, and shout out to everyone that helped me, Shelley, Dr. Staudinger, Dr. Rogers. I really appreciate you all.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That was all you.
Yep, it was all you. Good job. Excellent job.
Excellent job. We do have another presentation next Friday that will be covering COVID-19 vaccines and preliminary report on that. So please join us next week, same time, 1 o'clock, for another hopefully incredible presentation by one of our KCU student doctors. Everybody have a nice weekend, and thank you so much for coming.